Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I am Kelsey Marie Borland. I'm a freelance journalist, and we are hosting a webinar with Northspire today about it's a commercial real estate developer's guide to Washington. It's all about advocating for your business, and I am so excited about this. I think it's a really important topic, and we have an ebook component that will go along to this as well that we're excited to share with everyone. So let's go ahead and get started. Our agenda today, we're going to talk about the power of advocacy, the importance of advocacy. We're going to talk about our industry's advocates, which is really the kind of the organizations that are advocating for commercial real estate developers and owners and investors in Washington and kind of helping to craft policy. We'll talk about the 2025 policy agenda that's been set out by these organizations. We'll talk about past policy successes and why this advocacy has been so important, how it's kind of shaped some of the activity in the commercial real estate market, some of the regulatory activity. And then we'll talk about the importance of local advocacy. And if we have time at the end, we will do a Q&A if we have a few minutes to spare. If not, we always encourage you to send your questions over to our team, and we will answer any questions we can once the webinar is over. So let's just hop into this. So I love this story. I really wanted to talk about the importance of advocacy and really kind of advocacy through an industry organization, which is what we're talking about today. This happens across industries, right? There are organizations that come together through membership, really through grassroots individuals who are, everyday active in whatever industry they're in. They join an organization and then together they have a voice that really can drive actual change and policy decisions in Washington through their elected officials. And this is obviously not commercial real estate, it's farming. But this great story that's called the Tractorcade happened in February 1979. And there were a group of really small mom and pop farmers that were really upset about the price floor that was being set for produce by the government. It was being set below the cost of production, and small farmers were really losing money because of this. And so the farmers got together. They created, right around that time in the late 70s, the American Agriculture Movement. And they got this kind of protest together, and they drove tractors from the farmlands in middle America, from as far away as Colorado, 15 miles an hour to Washington, D.C., really to make a statement about what was happening and really to kind of show their presence and their importance. There were 1.5 million farmers that were involved in this movement, and like 3,000 to 5,000 tractors that drove across the country to kind of make their statement on it, and created these amazing photos of tractors in Washington kind of driving down Pennsylvania Avenue and outside the Capitol building. But it was actually really successful. There was they drove in the winter. They ended up kind of withstanding this big blizzard that came into Washington, D.C. But ultimately they left. But the organization actually still exists today. Small kind of grassroots organization. And they really are invited to the table in Washington to discuss policy that shapes farmers and agriculture in the U.S. And so just kind of a fun story to show you that individuals that get together and form these organizations in any industry really can make a splash. And it's important to kind of watch what's happening in Washington. And when something is happening that's not a positive impact on your business, it's okay to kind of get together and have your voice heard. But there are these great images from it of these tractors. There are some here kind of driving in front of the Capitol building, and some in the snow. And they all kind of had these protest signs about, their organization and about food prices in the U.S. So this is kind of just a fun example of what we're talking about, and really kind of happening today. I think the National Home Builders Association just had 1,000 people in June in Congress to kind of go and advocate for the industry. So this is still happening today. Not driving tractors, but definitely still getting large groups of people together to go and take meetings with elected officials and really make sure their voices heard. There's some great images from just some big meetings that were held just this month from commercial real estate leaders. So still an effective way to make sure that you can go and really have those important conversations with the people that are writing policy and writing legislation. And that, of course, I just want to say is really regardless of the administration in office. It's relevant regardless, across the political spectrum. So really not a political conversation, but really just making sure you're participating in the legislation that's being crafted so that you make sure that it's benefiting your business or even, not harming your business. And that is a great reason why we invest in advocacy. I've covered commercial real estate for almost 15 years. At this point, I've been to many, many conferences, and I've heard something like this quote year over year over year. If you're not paying attention to Washington, then you aren't paying attention to your business. And that really is just to say that regulation, particularly in commercial real estate, it's really regulatory impacted industry. If you're not paying attention to those regulations, if you're not paying attention to the kind of policies that are being shaped, it really, really can impact kind of your bottom line so easily. It can create barriers. It obviously affects taxes, zoning, tax credits. It affects private property ownership. So it's really, really important to make sure that you are aware of the policy that is being created, current regulation, new regulation, and really saying, I have a comment to make about that, and really making sure that the policy kind of reflects the industry that it's going to be impacting, and making those changes kind of before it actually becomes actually goes into effect. So I think it's important to note this as well, because we talk about why it's important to advocate for yourself, advocate in Washington. Obviously, policy impacts our business, but commercial real estate also is a giant, right? We are a really, really big industry, and we're an industry that is an important part of our economic engine. So not only is it important for us to advocate, or our industry to advocate for ourselves, it's also important for elected officials to listen to what we have to say, right? This is an industry that contributes $2.5 trillion to US GDP. It supports over 14 million jobs, generates $862 billion in personal earnings. And for every $1 in construction spending, $2.95 is generated for the economy. So this is a real powerhouse industry. So it's important to have that symbiotic relationship with elected officials to make sure that we are able to do, the job, or you're able to do your jobs. You're able to build, you're able to provide the community resources that you're providing, whether that is housing, grocery stores, retail, schools, offices. All of those things are so important to communities. They're important to our economy. And so it's important to say, like, hey, we're not able to do those things if we have, XYZ in place. So I think there's a real relationship happening there. And it's a real reason for elected officials in Washington to really listen to what our industry professionals have to say. So there are literally hundreds of organizations that advocate for the commercial real estate industry, which is a great thing, right? And it's happening at the local level. Real estate obviously is a very localized industry. It's happening at the national level. So if you have a specific need, or something very specific that you're concerned about, I promise you there is an organization out there that really is going to align with your needs. And I really encourage you to go out and look for that organization. I highlighted 5 of the major organizations in commercial real estate that are kind of the biggest ones, the powerhouses. Those are the National Association for Home Builders, NAIOP, which it used to be the National Association for Industrial and Office Properties, but they've expanded. They cover all properties now. National Multifamily Housing Council, ICSC, and the Real Estate Roundtable. So these are kind of the top 5 organizations that are really doing so much across the spectrum. They have membership from a wide range of real estate leaders, and they advocate for kind of everybody across the spectrum. So these are kind of the biggest organizations to pay attention to. Most of them have both national and local chapters, so you can participate on both levels. And they kind of all provide comments on new policy. They review potential impacts of new policy. They're reviewing current policy to see where maybe we can remove some regulation that's become burdensome. Maybe it wasn't burdensome at the time that it was created, but it's burdensome now, or maybe it's not necessary anymore. And they also do other things. They educate people in the industry. They educate people about the industry. They're massive media machines often. And they also, provide opportunities for people to get together and network and, share information across the country. So these 5 industries really play an important role for commercial real estate. We're going to kind of go over each one here so we know what they all are. This is NAIOP. Like I said, it used to stand for the National Association of Industrial and Office Properties when it was originally founded. Now they cover every single property under the sun: office, industrial, retail, mixed use. They work with developers, owners, operators, capital partners, kind of everyone. They have 21,000 members, local, national chapters, really active, very, very active across the country. Later on, we're going to talk about policy successes, and you'll really see where they have really, really been impactful in driving change. So really exciting about that. And this is a great organization because not only do they serve as a policy advocate, but they produce incredible research. I use their research a lot in stories. I think they have great research just if you're, trying to understand a market or commercial real estate trends. It's a great organization to look at their research. They provide networking opportunities. They host conferences across the country. North Spire was just at an NAIOP conference on the East Coast. So this is a great organization really for anyone participating in the commercial real estate industry, but definitely for real estate developers. National Association of Home Builders, also great for developers. They a huge organization. They have 140,000 members and they have both national and local chapter offices. But because they have such huge membership, this organization actually, their members are responsible for building 80% of all the new homes in the U.S. Year over year, every year. About 80%, their members build about 80% of the new homes, which is really, really incredible. And I think that specifically is so incredible because the members are really every single day building homes and really understanding the teeny tiny issues that they run into. And they can report that back to this organization. And then NAHB really goes to Washington and says, like, these are the problems that we're experiencing. This is where we can remove regulation. Obviously, this is focused on home builders. I know a lot of the people in this audience are more focused on multifamily building, but they're really working generally on cleaning up construction codes, cleaning up building codes, really removing any construction burdens, regulatory burdens. And so this is really a big advocate for just developers in general. And in addition to kind of just being advocates or their public advocacy, they also have the Builds PAC, Political Action Committee, which kind of helps to support their policy agenda. So they actually operate a PAC as well and really have deep relationships in Washington through that. So, really important organization for developers. National Multifamily Housing Council, obviously a huge one for anybody in multifamily. It is the leading national organization for the multifamily industry. They cover the entire life cycle of multifamily. So they advocate for everything from policy that's impacting development and of multifamily all the way to advocating for renters on the rental side, advocating for landlords, making it easier to operate a multifamily property. So really kind of that start to finish life cycle. They know every single piece of that multifamily transaction. And because of that, they represent the interests of 40 million rental homes in the US. Really, really massive and incredible. And they also operate a PAC, the NMHC PAC, which has recently raised more than $2 million. So they also have some good funding behind them to really kind of drive change for the industry. And you'll see later, they've really managed to do that. So this is an important one too for multifamily. We have the ICSC it's the International Council for Shopping Centers. I think they recently rebranded because I think they're expanding even beyond shopping centers to include any kind of marketplaces or commerce. But it really is the leading organization for the operators and developers of any sort of retail space or any sort of space where people gather, even mixed use properties that have another type of real estate component. I think that's part of their rebranding. They're kind of more than shopping centers, but policy advocacy is part of their mission, along with education, research, and events. And so the organization has played a really, really important role in the retail sector. And I think as we've seen this kind of crossbreed of property types recently, where we've seen so many more mixed use properties or retail attached to multifamily, retail attached to office, this has also become a really important organization to kind of advocate for those spaces, even beyond just a traditional shopping center. Like the other organizations, they also have networking opportunities. They host really amazing conferences. And they produce really important research for the industry as well. And finally, we have the Real Estate Roundtable. This is a really incredible organization. It's an invitation-only organization, but it's a kind of very strategically tailored coalition of developers, owners, lenders, property managers, a lot of people across the industry spectrum, and they really do a deep dive into real estate policy, any policy that impacts real estate. If you go on their website, they just have such a wealth of information. If there is something that you're really interested in or that you're concerned about, I would really encourage you to go to the Real Estate Roundtable. They have tons of information. They just kind of very objective information. And then they kind of also, alongside that, publish their stance on the topic, as well as a strategic plan to kind of make change around it. There's a real kind of 3-step process that they go to, which is education, then kind of taking a stance for the industry, and then really executing on an agenda. And this is another organization that has really, really deep relationships in Washington and can really drive change for that reason. They offer a deep fact-based analysis of both current and proposed legislation. I think that's really important. This is an organization that's really sitting down and going through all of the regulation that is impacting real estate every day, whether that is regulation that is established and, maybe sometimes long established, as well as new regulation that's being proposed. So they actually really, really can effectuate change by identifying pain points for the industry and then trying to remove those pain points, whether or not they're new or existing. They also have a great research database as well. So I really encourage everybody to kind of go check out all of their information. It's a really great organization. All right, so let's kind of dive into the 2025 policy agenda. So I will say we put this presentation together. As usual, we could do a presentation on any one of these topics, but when we put this presentation together, we really wanted to focus on how developers could really participate in Washington. I thought it was important to kind of highlight what those policy agendas of these organizations are. I'm sure a lot of it is going to align with concerns that each of you have. All of these policy agendas, every single one of the organizations had commented on. So there's a definite cross concern here about each of these topics. This is not just one organization that's taking this on. Some organizations are more focused on some issues than other organizations, but in general, everyone is concerned about all of these topics kind of industry-wide. We're going to kind of do a brief overview of each one. If you have any questions, we can either take them at the end or you can send them later about any one of these specific topics, but we'll just kind of go through them. They include tax policy, capital availability, energy availability, and then affordable housing are kind of the big policy agenda topics for 2025 that each of these organizations are covering. So let's go with tax policy. This is a big one. It's really big for everybody. There are multiple tax issues, I think, that people want to address. Some of them get very, very deep. This is absolutely not a comprehensive list. So if there's something that you're concerned about, know that it's probably being addressed by one of these organizations. These are just kind of the big issues that these organizations are talking about or that the industry is talking about and worried about. Some of them have come, like I said, this really spans the political spectrum. And so, and regardless of the political administration, there are going to be things that people support or things that people are concerned about. Like I said, there are going to be passed. Maybe it's a moment to deregulate from past regulations that have been put in place. So some of these have been part of the policy agenda for years and years that are, that organizations are still trying to make sure that they protect and they advocate for. So opposing carried interest reform is a big one that was suggested this year and late last year. Carried interest obviously affects any kind of fund management, but that is particularly prevalent in commercial real estate. It's a way that many fund managers make money. And obviously it's an important part sometimes of raising capital for a commercial real estate deal. And so the industry in general opposes any reform to carried interest. We're also protecting 1031 exchanges or like-kind exchanges. That has sort of been on the chopping block as this kind of rotating issue that comes up every once in a while. And it really, really is a big concern for the commercial real estate industry. A huge amount of the transactions that occur in commercial real estate obviously are like-kind exchanges or 1031 exchanges. And that is because if you sell a property, you can, in a like-kind exchange, you can obviously transfer the gain into another investment. There's some restrictions obviously around how that works, and you don't have to pay capital gains taxes on it, right? So if there was a removal of the 1031 exchanges, that would really, really deeply impact investment activity in commercial real estate. So always kind of at the top of that list is to protect 1031 exchanges. Advocating for the renewal of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Acts of 2017. A lot of that is up for expiration soon. And so I think this has been front and center too in the news. It looks like we're going to get the renewal of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, but this has been a big part of the commercial real estate policy agenda this year, and really, really pushing for a lot of those changes to become permanent so that we don't have to do this over and over again. Big advocacy for that, and opposing any new tariffs on building materials and other essentials to real estate construction. Obviously, the tariffs have been a huge topic this year, and particularly for raw materials, lumber, steel, other raw materials that are important to commercial real estate developers and development, really, really put pressure on the cost of construction, which was already under pressure. So the industry generally opposes any tariffs on any of these materials, and all of these organizations are working closely with their elected officials in Washington to try to see what can be done to remove any tariffs, or at least reduce the burden on the construction industry in particular. That's not really a widespread opposition to tariffs. It's really focused on removing tariffs or reducing tariffs for construction materials. And then lowering capital gains taxes or eliminating unrealized gains taxes. Also very important. I think that kind of goes hand in hand with the 1031 exchange, but capital gains taxes are very high, and that's the tax that commercial real estate owners or developers pay when they sell a completed property or they sell an investment. And so just kind of reducing the cost of capital gains taxes or unnecessary taxes like unrealized gains taxes. These are all the tax-related policy reform that organizations are pushing this year. This is on the 2025 agenda. Also on the 2025 agenda is housing affordability. I think that this is on the agenda for a lot of people. We have a housing crisis in this country, and we're underhoused. And it's been, I think, for many, many political leaders, has been a primary goal to work with developers, work with the real estate industry to build more housing. And that just isn't any housing, but affordable housing. And I think developers and the development community have been pretty unanimous in saying that tax credits are a really important way to make sure that we can build more housing, make housing more affordable, and really kind of meet the supply needs of the people of this country. And these are kind of the most important tax credits. The LIHTC tax credits, which are the low-income housing tax credits, those have been really important. They were just renewed recently a few years ago. We have the 9% credit and the 4% credit. The 9% credit is essentially a 70% subsidy of construction costs, and the 4% credit kind of works out to be a 30% subsidy of construction costs. So these are a major component of really pushing affordable housing forward, and the industry is unanimous and very protective of making sure that these the LIHTC housing credits are protected. There's also the workforce housing tax credit, which is a great tax credit because it's a 50% subsidy in construction costs, but it actually has obviously, because it's workforce housing, a higher AMI burden. Higher AMI requirement. So you can kind of capture more demand, a little bit less regulation around AMI. And so that's a great tax credit too. So really advocating for the workforce housing tax credit. And then in general, the industry is really supportive of establishing tax credits, federal tax credits in general. One that many companies, many of these organizations are pushing for specifically is advocating for an adaptive reuse tax credit. We have a real need for housing in this country, but in other asset classes, we have oversupply. Office is a really good example of that. We've talked a lot about in the past with Northspire about office to apartment conversion opportunities, which are becoming really, really more and more popular as office buildings kind of are priced in a place that make them viable for a conversion to apartment properties. But still, that is a very difficult, often transition to make. Office doesn't necessarily easily lend itself to conversion into apartment buildings. And a lot of properties don't easily lend themselves to conversion into an apartment building, just because apartments need, they have individual units, right? So you need plumbing, you need electrical, you need a kitchen, you need bathrooms running to each unit. And so the infrastructure of the building isn't necessarily built for that when you're working from another asset class into apartments. So something like an adaptive reuse tax credit can make it a lot easier for developers to convert a property into a higher and better use. And usually that higher and better use is housing. Because there's so much concern around housing, the housing crisis and housing supply, I think this is one that the industry could actually really push forward and make work. So it's really exciting and kind of an area to watch, I think, to see if we can get that done. Capital availability. always looking closely at capital availability. The big one here is really around Fannie and Freddie. There's been a lot of talk really for a long time now about removing Fannie and Freddie from their government conservatorship. I think generally these organizations are in favor of that, or at least don't kind of take a neutral opinion on whether, what kind of happens to Fannie and Freddie if they become privatized. But there's real advocacy around safeguards for any changes that are made to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac just during that transition period. I think that's important to make sure that current clients through Fannie and Freddie are protected in case they are transitioned into private entities. Also, the removal of the beneficial ownership provision, another big advocacy point. And then there's a lot of support for the Secure and Fair Enforcement Banking Act to support cannabis-related businesses. There's a real mismatch between local and state regulation around cannabis use and the federal regulation around cannabis use. And there's a lot of really great opportunities for cannabis businesses in real estate through both development and just, tenancy and demand, both in retail and office. But because cannabis-related businesses have difficulty using the federal banking system, that those become kind of problematic deals for commercial real estate owners. And so the Secure and Fair Banking Enforcement Act, I think, would kind of help to give some confidence to real estate owners working with those businesses in states where they can legally operate. And energy use. This is a big one across the industry. I think particularly for the National Association of Home Builders is really focused on some of these energy regulations. A lot of this has to do with reducing environmental regulation, particularly environmental regulation that is overly burdensome and overly cost restrictive. And to do a lot of that has to do with creating more cost-effective building codes. But in addition to that, they're also really advocating for reform to energy generation and updating and modernizing the national grid. All of those things, I think, would make it easier to build a lot of properties. And I think it would reduce a lot of the energy burden on homeowners as well as developers. It would allow for more sites to become viable development sites as well as access to the utility. So really important things happening around energy reform, particularly out of the National Association for Home Builders. So these organizations are really making a big difference. It has a meaningful impact. They're defeating new proposed legislation or proposed policy, reducing regulation, reducing the cost of construction. And they had even, a lot of these decisions can go all the way up to the Supreme Court, and we've seen victories there too. So now I'm talking about a little bit about some of the big differences that these organizations have made. We'll talk about some legislative wins. NAIOP in particular, it really gets down in the weeds of some really local or state level legislation that can really impact the commercial real estate industry. A local chapter of NAIOP in California recently defeated Assembly Bill 2840. The Assembly Bill that was proposed said that there could be no industrial or warehouse development within 1,000 feet of what was deemed a sensitive site. That was really unclear, what a sensitive site would mean. And so it was really effectively going to just completely stall most industrial development. And as many of you know, California is a huge industrial market. We're home to the largest ports in the country. And so really important prong of California's commercial real estate market is the industrial sector. And so this really would have eliminated a lot of new warehouse development, new industrial development. So the local chapter was very integral in defeating that Assembly Bill. And then several local chapters have also defeated statewide rent control this year or in the last year, including in Washington and Idaho. Actually, the picture in the background here is the Washington State Assembly voting on its kind of statewide rent control bill that was defeated. And just really focused on reviewing all of the legislation that's kind of coming up and making sure that the commercial real estate industry is represented in those policy decisions. Lots of unnecessary regulations removed as well. National Multifamily Housing Council actually has been really, really effective in removing and eliminating regulations in the past few years. This last year alone, NMHC has helped remove 9 regulations, which is so impressive. And among those regulations, they suspended the 2015 Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Rule, AFFH. This was, AFFH has been around for a long time. It's still technically in effect, but it has kind of evolved over the years and had become really overly burdensome. It was started to require that zoning, the federal government had some control over zoning changes, and became this really kind of complex process to comply with AFFH. And so the rule has been officially suspended in January of this year. They also suspended HUD's Reducing Barriers rule to help streamline HUD-assisted housing development. So a lot of these rules just became overly burdensome. They became like a paperwork nightmare, and they ended up increasing the cost of development because of these processes. So those rules have been suspended. They also managed to pause the SEC climate disclosure mandates, also kind of just a burdensome regulation for developers to maintain. This year, the NMHC has identified 32 other rules or regulations across 10 different agencies that they are reviewing and hoping that they can also somehow suspend or eliminate. And they work really, really closely with elected officials to do that. Kind of also as a result of their advocacy, they have managed to at least help ensure that no new multifamily regulations were created at all in 2024. So that's really exciting for the industry. We're removing regulations and not creating any new regulations. And that is only going to help multifamily developers to build more housing and get more housing out and completed. Also reducing construction costs. This is another National Association of Home Builders has helped to reduce taxes, helped to create more cost-effective building codes. They've established more resources to make workers safe. They've completed insurance reforms. And as a result of all of these changes, this is kind of through 2020, they have managed to reduce the cost of building each new home by $6,000 per home. Which I think as developers, we can all agree that every kind of dollar counts when you're looking at your bottom line. So also, I think really impressive to see that just by nothing else changing except reworking some regulation, removing some regulation, you can save kind of significantly on your bottom line. So these changes that are being made really, really do have an impact on the development. And then, the advocacy can really go, like I said, all the way to the Supreme Court. I think this is a really, really good example of a big Supreme Court win for the commercial real estate industry. It's Sackett versus the EPA really established the kind of definition of waters of the United States, or at least a clearer definition. And so you can see in the photo, you have the Sackett wetlands. There was a development site on the Sackett wetlands, which is very close to Priest Lake, and they have wetlands on the site. The EPA came in and told them to completely halt construction and that they could not build on that site because they had navigatable waters because they're so close to Priest Lake, and they were saying those wetlands are actually part of the waters of the United States. The Supreme Court, I put the Supreme Court unanimously ruled that the Clean Water Act only extended to wetlands that have a continuous surface connection to the waters of the United States, not just any wetland. It was a big, big definition. I just want to qualify the unanimously. There was no dissenting opinion. There was a majority opinion, 5-4, and then a concurring opinion that was written by the remaining 4 justices. In the industry, I think we all kind of celebrated that as a unanimous decision because there was no dissenting opinion. And so clearly there was kind of some consensus around this definition of waters of the United States. The case was supported by every commercial real estate organization, but NAIOP and the NMHC in particular were really, really big advocates for this case. They really, really helped push it into kind of the mainstream sphere to kind of create educate the public about this case. And so the ruling was really considered a huge win for the development industry. Sackett won, and now not only did they win and they were able to continue on with their construction project, but we now have this very clear definition of what waters of the United States are, which really just helps developers moving forward who are building on a site that has a wetland or on a site that is near a lake or other body of water. So we have a better definition over that as well. And then I really wanted to make a kind of pitch for local advocacy. These are some great kind of city hall buildings and state capitals. And I think it's so important to remember that commercial real estate is not a big national industry. While national policy and regulation really impacts our industry, and it's so important to know what's going on in Washington, we're really an industry that works at a hyper local level, supplying property to communities, developing on land in communities. And so your local regulation and state regulation also has a major impact on your business. So it's not only important to pay attention to what's happening in Washington, but it's also important to pay attention to what's happening in your city and your state. For that reason, many of the organizations that we talked about today have local chapters, both city and state level, that you can participate in. That's why we see organizations like NAIOP really getting involved in state level legislation to make sure that no new regulatory burdens are created at that level. And so real estate advocacy is really important here too. And I want to really just wanted to make sure that I made that point, that it's important to kind of pay attention to what's going on in Washington. I think we all get really swept away today with what's happening in Washington, but a lot of times you can make big change in just your city and state, and it doesn't take as many people, right? It can only take maybe one person standing up and saying this isn't right, or calling the mayor's office, calling your governor's office, and really saying like, hey, we're having this problem, and kind of pushing forward on change at that level as well. I want to say thank you so much. This was a great presentation. Thank you so much for joining us. If you have any questions, please send them over to the Northspire team, and we will make sure that we answer them. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate your time.